The candles in the assembly rooms at Melling had been burning for 2 hours when Eleanor Ashford first saw the man who called himself the Earl of Venmore. He stood near the far pillar with the easy authority of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy space. He was fair-haired and broad in the shoulders, his coat cut to a standard Eleanor recognized as expensive without knowing quite why she found it wrong on him. Too correct, perhaps, as though it had been assembled from a portrait rather than worn in the ordinary course of a life. Beside him, Lady Frederica Rowland held her glass with the grip of a woman who had held things for a long time and intended to hold them considerably longer. She was speaking to Mrs. Calder when she caught Eleanor's eye across the floor. She did not speak. She only looked at Eleanor the way one looks at furniture left slightly out of position, and then returned to Mrs. Calder's ear with a murmur Eleanor could not quite catch. She did not need to catch it. The posture was sufficient. What arrested her entirely was the groom. He stood in the servants' passage beside the musician's arch, visible only because Eleanor had positioned herself near the wainscoting rather than the floor. James Holt stood at the edge of the candlelight with his hands quiet at his sides and his eyes fixed on the fair-haired man at the far pillar. His jaw was level. His face was the face of a man holding something carefully below the surface of himself, not straining against it, simply holding it, the way a river holds itself below the ice without any visible effort at all. He did not see Eleanor watching him. He saw only the man at the pillar, and the quality of his looking was the most concentrated thing in the room. She did not know, that evening, that the watch he pressed once against his breast pocket was engraved with a stag. She did not know that the fair-haired man at the pillar had been living in a house that was not his for nearly 3 years. She knew only that James Holt's face was the most honest thing in that room, and that Lady Frederica Rowland, turning back toward her son with a small and particular smile, was the least. If you have ever stood in a room where a deception has been raised to ceiling height and decorated with fresh flowers, you will recognize what Eleanor felt in her bones long before she understood it in her mind. Eleanor Ashford had lived at Ashford Park in Melling for all of her 24 years, and she had learned early that a country gentleman's household runs by the effort of the people inside it rather than the opinions of those outside. Her father, Sir Henry Ashford, had been a man of comfortable acres and comfortable habits until the winter before last, when a congestion of the chest had settled into him and declined to leave. He was not dying, the physician said with the manner of physicians who mean the opposite. Sir Henry received his visitors in the library now, rather than from the saddle, and he had grown very fond of his fire and his dogs, and of the particular way his daughter managed the household's daily business, without appearing to manage anything at all. The estate was modest. 240 acres of good land, a house that required more in maintenance than it returned in rents, and a staff of 8, including the groom who had arrived on a Wednesday morning 2 years ago with a letter of introduction from a retired officer in the neighboring county, and a facility with horses that Sir Henry had pronounced remarkable and hired without further inquiry. Eleanor had not been consulted. She had watched the new groom settle the Ashford mare after a bad morning in the lane and decided her father had been right. James Holt. He was 32, or perhaps a year or two older. With the careful economy of movement that Eleanor associated with men who had spent time in conditions where economical movement mattered. He was not forthcoming. He did not drink with the other staff, did not idle, did not ask questions about the family beyond what his work required. He was not unkind. He had a quality of attentiveness that was not warmth exactly and not surveillance exactly, but something between the two that she had spent 2 years failing to name precisely. When he spoke to her, his voice was low and level, and he said only what he meant to say. and he never said more than that. She had not told anyone about the morning in the tack room when she had come before the household stirred and found him by the window with a small book open in his hands. He had looked up at her approach and closed it without hurry, as though he had been reading a letter rather than a volume of Cicero in the Latin, and she had seen the lettering on the spine in the moment before he lowered it. She had said nothing. She had gone to the mare's stall and done what she had come to do, and he had stood and returned to work beside her in the usual quiet. She had thought about it, in the weeks following, more than was strictly warranted. The quality of the moment had been less the strangeness of it, and more the naturalness, the way he had simply continued being who he was, as though there were no contradiction between Cicero and a stable yard, as though he had long since made his peace with whatever distance separated the man he was from the circumstances he occupied. She had watched him with the mare's foal the following spring, sitting on the straw for 2 hours in the small hours of the night, entirely silent, entirely patient, not coaxing or commanding, but simply present in the way one is present with something fragile, and she had understood then that whatever he had been before had taught him to wait. She had not known what he was waiting for. She had supposed it was general. She was beginning to understand it was not. That was the quality she could not name. The quality of a man who had been somewhere and was now somewhere else, and had found no language for the distance between those two places, only the body that had traveled it. Eleanor's own constraint had no such dignity of mystery. It was entirely legible to anyone who cared to read it, and she had long since stopped minding that most people read it as a conclusion rather than a condition. When Sir Henry died, the estate would pass to a distant cousin in Northumberland, whose name she had been told once, and had not required since. There was no entail that served her, no dowry that anyone in the county considered sufficient, and no position available to a gentleman's daughter who was neither accomplished enough for a fashionable household, nor willing enough to be diminished by an indifferent one. She was, to the season, simply a young woman of limited prospects, who managed her father's house very ably, and would presumably manage someone else's house in due course if anyone suitable could be persuaded to require managing. The assembly rooms at Melling had held this opinion of her for 3 seasons, and she had attended every one of them with the composure of someone who has heard the verdict and has decided not to contest it, only to outlast it. It was, perhaps, why she noticed things other people in those rooms did not notice. When your own story offers nothing to watch, you watch other people's. The morning after the Melling assembly, Lady Frederica Rowland called at Ashford Park. This was not usual. Venmore Hall sat 3 miles to the east, and Eleanor's father held a distant social acquaintance with the previous holder of the title from long county custom, though the 2 houses had never been intimate. Lady Frederica came without her son, sat in the morning room, declined tea with a precision that managed to be offensive while remaining technically correct, and spoke about the neighborhood and the season and last evening's assembly until she had decided Eleanor had been sufficiently warmed up for what she had actually come to say. "Your father tells me you manage a great deal of the household yourself," she said. "It is very commendable in a young woman of your circumstances. My son noticed you last evening. He finds the country quite engaging after the season in London." A pause, very carefully placed. "The squire's daughter, naturally. One would not expect any particular. That is, he is very much attended to, as I am sure you understand. There are connections far more suited to his station requiring his attention this season, and I would not wish you to form any misapprehension about the nature of any civility he might show." She said it warmly, which was what made it efficient. Eleanor thanked her for calling and saw her to the door. She told James about it that afternoon without intending to. She had come to the stable with a bridle that needed a new buckle, and the afternoon was gray and close, and she simply said it aloud as though thinking. And he listened without turning from the saddle he was cleaning. Then he said, in his level voice, "The man at the pillar last night, Miss Ashford, is not the Earl of Venmore." She had been very still. The bridle was in both hands, and the buckle clinked once against the leather. He said nothing further. She walked back to the house with the bridle still unbuckled, and the shape of what he had not said stayed with her through the evening and into the night, and the gray morning after that. The weeks that followed brought Charles Rowland to Ashford Park 3 times. He came first on the pretext of returning a hunter Sir Henry had lent to a mutual acquaintance. He came again under the pretext of arranging a hunt subscription. He came a 3rd time on a Tuesday morning when the frost was still hard on the paddock, and no pretext had been prepared, with the manner of a man who has decided that arriving unasked is a privilege he need not petition for. Eleanor met him on each occasion because her father's health did not reliably permit otherwise, and she found Charles Rowland to be precisely what his coat suggested. A man constructed entirely from surfaces, educated into confidence, and uninterested in anything behind the faces of the people in front of him. He spoke about London, and the hunt, and the improvements he intended for Venmore Hall. He did not ask Eleanor a question that required an actual answer. He looked at the house in the appraising way of someone considering a property for acquisition, and he looked at Eleanor with a similar quality of appraisal, the kind that calculates without attending, and she was glad, in a dry, private way, that she had never once looked back at him the same way. He was unfailingly polite. That, too, was a kind of statement. On the day of the 3rd visit, Charles's carriage came into the lane at the same moment Eleanor was returning from the church on horseback. The mare shied at the noise of the wheels on the frozen ground, and Eleanor held her seat, but only barely. And for one long second the lane was too narrow, and the carriage too fast, and the mare's head too high. Then James was there, stepping out of the gate between them with his hand on the mare's bridle, steadying her with a word and a specific pressure, placing himself between horse and carriage wheel in the entirely matter-of-fact way of someone who had assessed the situation and decided what was necessary. "Go inside, Miss Ashford," he said. Not unkindly, not with any particular urgency, simply with the certainty of someone who has issued a command and sees no reason it will not be followed. Charles, stepping down from the carriage, did not look at the groom at all. Eleanor understood more that same afternoon. Charles had stayed longer than courtesy required, and by the time she returned from seeing him to his carriage, Sir Henry was pleasantly tired, and mentioned that young Rowland had raised some arrangement about the property, something about a subscription or the East acreage. He had not attended very carefully. Eleanor sat with him until he slept, and then went to the library table where Charles had left a document under a pen stand. The papers concerned the East acreage. They concerned it in considerable detail, and the terms were those of a man who expected compliance rather than consultation. James was in the stable-yard splitting kindling when she crossed the frost toward him and held the papers out without speaking. He looked at the top sheet for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold air. He did not touch the document. He said, "Don't sign that." 2 words. The voice entirely level, the kind of level that has nothing casual in it. "My father may have already agreed to the general substance of it," Eleanor said. "He may have," James said. "Do not let the papers become formal. Find Mr. Pym before you do anything further." She looked at him in the late gray light of the yard, this man who read classical Latin before the household rose and split kindling in the afternoon, and watched the eastern horizon at dusk with the patient attention of a man waiting for something that was taking its time. She said, "Who are you, truly?" He was quiet for a moment that had a discernible shape, a shape with real edges. "A man who has been watching more carefully than you know," he said, and returned to the kindling. She went inside. She held the papers for 3 days. On the 4th day, she asked Mr. Walter Pym to call, under the pretext of reviewing the estate's existing tenancy arrangements, and she placed the unsigned pages on the table between them and watched his face. The solicitor's face did several things in rapid and revealing sequence. He asked her how she had come by the document. She told him. He folded the pages with a care that was evidently stalling, and then said he would need to make some inquiries before he could advise her properly, and she should not act until she heard from him. His voice had the specific quality of a man who already knows the answer to the question he has been asked, and needs time to decide how much of that answer to give. He looked at the document once more before he folded it, and the look was not the look of a man reading a document. It was the look of a man who has seen this document before. "Mr. Pym," Eleanor said, "I would prefer you to tell me what you know, rather than what you are prepared to confirm." He looked at her across the table for a long moment. He said, "I have recently been approached by a party with an interest in some historical county records. The matter is somewhat sensitive. I am not at liberty to say more until certain documents have been formally verified and certain procedural steps have been completed." "I see," Eleanor said. "Do not," he said carefully, "sign anything in the interim." She thanked him and showed him out. There are moments, she was learning, when the most useful thing anyone can offer is the particular shape of their silence. She held Mr. Pym's in both hands all the way back to the house. That evening she found James at the paddock fence. He was watching the sky in the direction of Venmore Hall, and the sky above Venmore was the color of smoke before snow. She stood beside him for a time without speaking. She said, "There was someone before. Before whatever this is." He was still for long enough that she believed he would not answer. He said, "My wife. She died while I was in the peninsula. She was 23 years old, and she died of fever while I was a month away. And by the time I came back, there was nothing left to come back to." He touched the pocket where the watch lived, the small unconscious pressure she had observed many times without understanding it. "Margaret," he said. Her name once, quietly. The way one says a name that is also a wound and has learned, over time, to say it without closing one's eyes. Eleanor said nothing. She was very still. "I was in a surgeon's cottage outside Ghent for 4 months, he said. "Not dying, but not reliably living either, which proved sufficient for my cousin's purposes. He sent a letter to the county solicitor stating I had perished at Waterloo. By the time I was well enough to write my own name, the letter had been received, recorded, and acted upon, and Charles Rowland had been resident at Venmore Hall for 6 weeks. He said this without heat, which was somehow worse than heat would have been. I came back in winter. I stood at the lane end and I looked at my own house with another man's candles in the windows, and I thought, very clearly, that I was not going to solve it that night. That night I went to the inn at Melbridge. The next morning I began looking for a direction from which I could work without being seen." He looked at her steadily. "Your father is known in this county as a man of good judgment and decent character. His stable wanted a groom. The records office is 3 miles from this yard. And you," he said, "were not the reason I stayed. You were the reason I did not mind staying." He said nothing further. The cold above the paddock settled. She believed him. She had believed him for 2 years without knowing she was doing it. She walked back to the house in the dark and thought about the fair-haired man at the pillar and his mother's smile and the document under the pen stand, and she thought about the inn at Melbridge and the winter lane end and a man standing outside his own house watching another man's candles burn in the windows. She thought about 2 years of Cicero in the early dark, and a level voice saying what it meant, and nothing more. The shape of everything settled into something she could finally see clearly, the way certain images only become legible when you step back to the right distance. She was not afraid of what she saw. She was simply in possession of it, the way one comes into possession of difficult knowledge, without ceremony, in the quiet. You might stay a little while for what comes next. You have already seen the most honest face in that room. Charles Rowland acted before she was ready for him to. The following Thursday was the second assembly of the Melling season. Eleanor attended with Mrs. Pratt because Sir Henry was not well enough and would not hear of her declining on his behalf. The rooms were full and warm, and the musicians were playing a reel. Lady Frederica Rowland was at the far pillar with her glass, and in the second hour, Charles found Eleanor near the window and guided her to the edge of the floor with a hand she had not offered him. He was very pleasant, in the way of someone who has prepared his pleasantness in advance and is satisfied with the preparation. "I am glad to have a moment with you this evening, Miss Ashford," he said, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as Mrs. Calder and the Misses Fenton and 4 other women whose positions Eleanor understood were not accidental. "Your father and I have reached a very agreeable understanding, and I wished you to hear it in company." Eleanor kept her expression still. It required some work. "An understanding," she said. "A formal arrangement," Charles said, with the lightness of a man adding a minor clarification to something already settled. "I have spoken with Sir Henry on several occasions, and he has given his approval most warmly. I intend to make it public this evening. The neighborhood is assembled and the moment is apt." He smiled at her with the ease of a man who has not been refused anything that mattered to him. "You will be very well provided for, Miss Ashford. You need not trouble yourself with the particulars." Eleanor looked toward the servants' passage. It was empty. She looked at the empty passage for one moment, and in that moment she understood something about hope that she had not known she was carrying until she saw the doorway bare. She had not known, until it was absent, how much of the past 2 years had quietly organized itself around that particular stillness in the peripheral dark. The musicians played. The candles burned at their accustomed height. Lady Frederica crossed the floor with the purposeful movement of a woman arriving at the conclusion she has already written. Lady Frederica turned to the gathered circle with a warmth so precisely managed it was nearly art. "My son has made a most commendable choice," she said. "It reflects his generosity, I think, to look so close to home, to elevate." She turned to Eleanor, and her look was the look she kept for furniture. "The girl who keeps company with grooms, raised to a countess. There is a lesson in it for us all, I am sure." The women around them laughed. Not cruelly, as such things generally go. That was what made it worse. Eleanor said, in a voice steadier than she had any reason to expect, "I have not heard this arrangement from my father." She looked at Charles. "You will forgive me, my lord, if I reserve my public response until I have spoken with Sir Henry directly. Tonight, if you are willing to accompany me." A small silence. Charles's smile held. "Your father has been most clear. Then he will have no difficulty repeating it to me in his own words," Eleanor said. She held his gaze for long enough that he understood she was not, in any register he had prepared for, afraid. Then she excused herself to Mrs. Pratt's side, and she walked with her spine very straight toward the far end of the room, and she did not look at the servants' passage again. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her father's bedside until the house was fully silent, and in the morning, when he was clear enough to talk, she showed him the document. She watched his face move through several things before settling into the grief of a man who understands he has been careless with something that was not his to be careless with. He had not understood, he said. He had thought it was about the hunt. He had thought the young man was being sociable. His hand shook on the page. Eleanor covered his hand with hers and did not speak about the previous evening. She let him rest. She drew the curtains to the correct angle for his eyes and set fresh water at his elbow, and told Mrs. Pratt that Sir Henry was not to be disturbed before noon. Then she went to the writing desk in the small room off the library where she had conducted the estate's correspondence for the past 2 years, and she sat down, and she looked at the paper in front of her for a long moment before she began to write. She sent a note to Mr. Pym at first light. She sent a second note to a direction James had given her once, without explanation, a forwarding address somewhere between Melling and the county records office. She did not know precisely what she was asking him to do. She sealed both letters before she could reconsider and gave them to the footman, and did not permit herself to think further about what she had done. Then she waited. The second evening found her again at the Melling Assembly Rooms, because Charles had sent word that he intended to present her formally to the county, and it was better to be present than to be spoken for in her absence. Mrs. Pratt came again. The rooms were quieter, a midweek gathering, the season's machinery moving at reduced pace. The same musicians, the same candles, the same pale pillar where Lady Frederica had stood the first evening, though tonight Lady Frederica was at a different position entirely, nearer the door, as though she had calculated the room's geometry in advance. Eleanor had dressed with care. She was not certain why she had dressed with care. She was not certain what she expected. She had sent 2 letters from a writing desk at 3 a.m, and had not permitted herself to think too precisely about what she had sent them for. Charles arrived with his mother at 8:15. James Rowland arrived at 50:30. He was not in the brown coat. He wore dark wool and a high cravat, and he carried himself with the complete and unconcealed authority of a man who had set something down for a necessary season and had now picked it up again, and who found, as one does with objects long and intimately known, that it had not changed in his hands. Mr. Walter Pym was at his left shoulder. An older man Eleanor did not recognize was at his right, the blue sash of the county Lord Lieutenant across his chest. Charles saw him from across the room, the fair hair, the jaw, the particular stillness. The color left Charles's face with a decisiveness that under any other circumstances might have been interesting to observe. James crossed the floor in 3 strides. He did not pause for Lady Frederica, who reached a hand toward his arm and then withdrew it. He did not pause for Mrs. Calder, or for the Mrs. Fenton, or for the small crowd that had begun, very quietly, to orient itself toward what was happening. He stopped in front of Charles Rowland, in the same assembly room, beneath the same candles, before very nearly the same witnesses who had heard the public announcement 2 evenings before. "The documents," Mr. Pym said at his shoulder. He placed a packet on the table beside them. "Certified records of birth and military service, letters attesting to survival in the Netherlands, countersigned by the Lord Lieutenant and the County Solicitor's Office. The title of the Earl of Venmore has at no point legally passed to any collateral branch of the family." Charles said, in a voice that had lost its pleasant surface, "You were dead." "I was wounded," James said. "There is a difference." The voice was exactly the voice Eleanor had heard for 2 years across a stable yard and a paddock fence, low and level and entirely certain. The voice that had said, "Don't sign that and go inside," and Margaret, once, into the cold above the paddock fence. The Lord Lieutenant confirmed in 3 plain sentences that the documents were in order, and the title belonged to the gentleman standing before them. He had the air of a man who had waited some time to say this, and was glad to have the occasion. Lady Frederica made a sound that was almost a word. Her glass tilted in her hand, She looked from her son to the man in the dark wool and then back, and something in her face that had been maintained with great care over a long time came apart at its edges, not dramatically, not in any way that required description, but with the particular quiet of a woman who has held a position for so long, she has forgotten it was ever a position, and not a truth, and who has just been shown the difference. Her son had opened his mouth and closed it again. He was not, in the end, a stupid man. He did not open it a second time. James turned. Eleanor was standing near the wall, as she had been the first evening, her hands at her sides, quite still. She had not moved since he came through the door. He crossed the room to her. He stopped close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw and the way he held himself when he was not performing anything at all. Simply present, simply the person he had always been in the stable yard and at the fence and at the window with the Cicero closed in his hands. He offered his hand, palm up, deliberate and fully public. He said, "Miss Ashford is not your intended, Charles. She is mine." 11 words, specific, irrevocable. The room held them in a moment that had no sound inside it, but the low settling of the candle flames. Eleanor looked at his hand for one breath, and then she placed hers in it, and the warmth of his palm against her cold fingers was the most precise and real thing she had felt in a very long time. Mr. Pym produced a secondary document whose presence on the table required no immediate attention, but whose existence was eloquent. The Lord Lieutenant offered a brief additional confirmation and withdrew with the dignity of a man whose supper was waiting. Mrs. Calder leaned to the Mrs. Fenton with the expression of a woman reorganizing a mental archive that has been filed incorrectly for some time. 2 of the younger women nearby were very quiet and very attentive in the way of people who are deciding how they have always felt about something. A man Eleanor recognized as a neighbor of her father's, a retired colonel named Briggs, who had known Sir Henry 30 years, crossed from the far side of the room and bowed to James Rowland with a brevity and a steadiness that said everything it needed to say. Lady Frederica looked at her son, who was looking at the floor, and in her looking there was the faint beginning of a recognition that the construction she had maintained so long had not protected the thing she thought it was protecting. She did not speak further. She did not need to. Her silence was the most useful thing she had offered the room in 3 years. Eleanor did not feel triumph. She felt the particular quiet that comes when something returns to its correct weight after being carried at the wrong angle for a long time. She felt the warmth of a hand around hers and the certainty that the man holding it had seen her, had been seeing her, for 2 years, with the total and careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. She was still holding James Rowland's hand when the musicians resumed. 3 mornings later, the sky above Melling was white and dense with the particular weight of a morning that has decided on snow before noon. Eleanor came to the stable yard before the household had properly risen, which was not unusual, and found James at the paddock fence, which was not unusual either. He had been at Venmore Hall for 2 nights, addressing the practical necessities of reclaiming what was his, and he looked slightly tired in the way of a man whose body has not yet settled into the change in his circumstances. He turned when he heard her boots on the frost. "You never told me about the stag," she said. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the watch. He held it open in his palm so she could see the engraving on the inside of the lid. The stag stood in a field of small crossed lines, the Rowland family crest cut into the metal by a craftsman who had not anticipated that the object would spend 2 years in a groom's coat in a country stable yard. The watch face itself was plain and clean. It ran, he said, without losing a minute. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. She thought of the number of evenings she had watched his hand press against that pocket, and had wondered, and had decided that the wondering was information enough for the time being. She reached out, and traced the stag with one finger. The metal was warm from the carrying of it. "My father gave it to me the morning I left for the peninsula," James said. "He died while I was in Spain. I did not know for 6 months." He was quiet for a moment. "I have kept it because it is the closest thing to an accurate account. Everything it belongs to still belongs to me, even the parts I was told had gone." Eleanor thought about that. She thought about a man standing at a lane end in winter, looking at candles in windows that were his. She thought about 2 years of patience that did not look like patience from the inside, that probably looked from the inside like simply continuing to do the work in front of you, until the work in front of you was done. She thought about the particular discipline of that, the particular cost of it, and the long, cold patience of it. And she thought it was perhaps the most honest thing she knew about him, more even than the Cicero. From the library window at the far end of the house, the silhouette of Sir Henry Ashford sat in his chair, facing the paddock. He raised one hand slowly toward the glass. Eleanor raised hers in return. The snow began then, in the tentative English way, as though testing the ground before committing. It fell on the fence post and on the stable roof, and on the wide, pale expanse of the paddock, and it fell on James Rowland's dark coat, and on the shawl across Eleanor's shoulders, and it made the whole yard very quiet in the way that snow makes things quiet, covering them gently and without any comment at all. James held the watch out toward her. She looked at him. "Keep it for today," he said. "Return it when you are ready." She took it from his hand. It was the size of a modest promise, warm from the keeping of it, and it ran without losing a minute. She did not return it that day, or in the weeks that followed, or in the spring that came afterward to the paddock at Venmore, or in any of the years after that, when the stag on the watch face ran in a field that was now her field too, and the library at Ashford Park was her father's in the comfortable fire-lit way it had always been, and the circle that had opened on a winter morning in a tack room over a volume of Cicero was at last, in the quiet of the first snow, without ceremony, without declaration, simply closed. If Eleanor's story has settled something in you, leave a word below. And if this is the first time you have found this place, consider making it a regular one.